Hey guys, and welcome back to Gardens and Grace. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Tasha. Today I'm going to be seed starting some tomatoes and some summer squash. I specifically have some dwarf tomatoes that I'm really excited to try. I've never grown dwarf tomatoes in my garden before, but I've done a lot of research and I'm really excited to try them just because they're going to be smaller and compact varieties that I don't have to stake or prune. I'm also going to grow a Dr. Wyche's yellow tomato, which I'm really excited about. I really love yellow tomatoes, and this is also a variety that I've never tried before. So I'm going to be seed starting them. I'm in the middle of May. Ideally, I would have started these maybe in March, February or March in my area so that I could plant them out right after the last frost date, which would be at the beginning of April. But because I have a very long growing season and because these don't take very long to mature at all, I'm gonna try them and I will definitely get a harvest before the fall comes. So the varieties I'm growing of my summer squash are a green scallop Bennings, a white scallop squash, the Dr. Wyche's yellow tomato. This is an indeterminate variety, I believe. Yes, this is an indeterminate variety. So I do need to stake it. I may let it go wild. We'll see what I do with it. A Mexico midget dwarf tomato. Geranium kiss dwarf tomato. And finally, a tiny Tim dwarf tomato. I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly where I'm going to put these in my garden. My garden is fairly full at the moment. I do have a little bit of space, but not as much as I would like to have to be planting out more tomatoes and summer squash, but that's okay. So I started by using a seed starting mix. I'm using this size cups to plant my squash and tomatoes. You definitely don't want to go with a small, like if I was to use a plug tray, something like this, my tomatoes and my squash are just going to get too big for it too quickly. So I definitely want to go with a larger cup. I'm using a specific seed starting cups. You don't have to. You could use a solo cup and poke some holes in the bottom. It's just really important that there's drainage so that there's holes in the bottom of whatever you're using to start your seeds and then it's large enough. Now, I'm going to also be doing bottom watering with my seed starts. I will show you that process. But right now, what I found that works best is when I do start my seeds is to make sure that the soil is already moist. So I'm using a seed starting mix that I added water to, and I don't want the seed starting mix sopping wet. Like I don't want it to be soaked with water, but I do want it to be moist. So I have a handful of seed starting mix here. And what I found is best is when I wet my seed starting mix, to make sure that it's wet enough, but not saturated, I will grab a handful of my soil and do it's getting everywhere, do a light squeeze. Now when I do a light squeeze, I can feel a little bit of that moisture, but there's not a lot dripping out of my hand. That means that it's not saturated. We don't want our soil saturated because then we would deal with our seeds possibly rotting in that soil. So just a quick tip. Now, I also labeled all of my cups. I already have them labeled before I even plant in them. So I know what I'm planting where. I'm terrible about doing this. I will label them very well when I seed start. I will usually label when I seed start, but when I put them out in the garden, I have no idea where I plant things. I just put them in places. So it's hard for me to keep up with varieties. I'm trying to do a little bit better this year while I take you along this journey of being able to tell you what varieties I have and where. I'm going to make some holes in the seed starting mix. Now for my tomatoes, I'm going to start with tomatoes. For tomatoes, I'm going to plant 2 seeds. What this will do is ensure germination. What it'll also do is if I have 2 tomato plants that do come up, I can separate out my tomato seedlings. The roots on the tomatoes are a little bit more forgiving. So if I plant 2 in this cup, I can actually use both of those tomatoes and plant them out in the garden. So I'm gonna make holes in everything, and then I'll go back through and add the seeds. Oh, for my squash, I'm just gonna plant one. I usually have really good germination with squash, so I don't worry too much about it. The other thing about squash is it's a fairly quick germinator. Within 2 to 3 days, I usually see them pop up. So I'm just gonna plant one seed, and in 2 to 3 days, if they don't pop up, I'll plant another one. I'm gonna take this glove off here because I just don't need it. I'm gonna get my hands a little dirty in the soil. That's part of being a gardener, right? So starting with my Dr. White Cheese tomato. Now you can, tomato seeds, squash seed, here's a good tip. The bigger the seed, the deeper you can plant it. So for my tomato seeds, this Dr. White Cheese tomato, they're not super big. And I don't have my holes here super big either. So I'm just gonna kind of put, I think I planted 3 seeds here. And then I'm just gonna use my finger to just kind of cover the soil around it, pack it down a little bit, just kind of to make sure that I have good contact with the soil. So Dr. White Cheese is planted. Let's do my Tiny Tim next. I've seen a lot of people grow these. I've never grown them before. I tried to last year, but I had a hard time finding seeds. But I've seen them grown and they look adorable. They're just cute. So I definitely want to try them in my garden. Like I said, I'm just going to cover it with a little bit of soil. This cup is I could have stood to maybe put a little bit more soil in this cup, but it's completely fine. They're going to do just fine. Geranium Kiss tomatoes. I may try to put these out in my front yard garden bed because they look really pretty. In my front yard garden bed, my goal out there is a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than in my backyard garden bed. So I try to make that space in my front yard look pretty. Whereas in my backyard, I grow more for production. So in the front yard, I still grow food and I still harvest food, but I grow more for aesthetics. And in my backyard, I'm growing more for production. Either way, I'm still harvesting food. And either way, I grow flowers like literally everywhere. Mexico midget tomato, same thing, same process. You know, a lot of people have asked me, how do they know when to water their seedlings? And I want to talk about that for a second. Seedlings like to stay moist, but not drowned in water. So what I like to do is do what we call a bottom watering. That kind of prevents the seedlings from being splashed out when we water. And what that means is, because there's holes in the bottom, of these cups, what I'll do is I'll use this tray that does not have holes in it, and I'll pour water in here. It takes some time to get used to how much water, but basically when you're first starting out, best practice is pour some water in the bottom of this and let your soil soak it up. If all the water is gone within a couple of minutes, you know you probably need to add more water to the bottom. But if after 20 minutes you still have water standing in your tray, you would just dump that water out so that your seeds aren't sitting in that water. And how often you do that is going to vary so much depending on your area, depending on the environment that you're in. I'm outside right now, so my seedlings tend to dry out a little bit quicker than if I had them indoors inside my house. So basically, the best way you can tell is to look at the top of the soil. So right now, let me get one I've already planted. Let's look at this one. So right now, you can tell that looks deep brown. It's pretty, it's deep brown, it's dark, right? I know because of the color of the top of the soil that it's got plenty of water in it. When I come out here and the tops look light brown, and it looks dry on the top of the soil, typically there's still more moisture down in the bottom of the soil because the top of the soil is going to dry out faster than the bottom. But for me, a good indication of when I need to bottom water is when the top of that soil, instead of looking that deep dark brown, starts to look very light brown, and it'll start to look dry and crumbly. And then I know it's time to water again. It could be every 3 days, it could be once a week, it could be every day if it's really hot outside. It really just depends. All right, now I'm gonna plant the white squash. I don't need 2 seeds for that. You'll notice the squash seeds are really big. Now, that means I can plant this a bit deeper in the soil and it's going to germinate very well. We actually want to get it a little bit deeper because the seed is so big. We want to make sure a good amount of soil is covering that seed. And last but not least, my green scallop binning squash. I lied. I have 2 cups for the green squash and 2 cups for the white squash. So I'm going to plant that. It's really important when we plant all of our seeds to make sure that we are covering those seeds with soil. So I just use my finger to kind of pack it down a little bit to make sure I have good contact with the soil. Now, I don't really need to water these right now because I pre-moistened that soil. But if I hadn't, I would go ahead at this stage and bottom water this seed tray. And like I said, let that water sit in there for about 20 minutes, and whatever excess water is left, you can dump out. I'm gonna check these every few days. Once the seedlings come up, once they get their first set of true leaves, I'm gonna add a water-soluble fertilizer. Water-soluble fertilizer, when you're seed starting, every 2 weeks, you're gonna add a water-soluble fertilizer after the first set of true leaves come. Now, I'm only gonna need to do that once for my squash, but I might need to do that 2 or 3 times for my tomatoes because they could really stay in here, like I said, up to 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Might be pushing it, but we really could do it up to 8 weeks if we wanted to. I probably won't let them stay in here that long. I'll probably do about 4 to 5 weeks, and then I should be able to plant them out into the garden. But I'm gonna add a water-soluble fertilizer once they have those true leaves, and for every 2 weeks after that until I plant them in the garden. The reason I'm gonna do that is because the seed starting mix does not have any nutrients in it. It's light and it's fluffy and it's aerated and it's good to start the seeds in, but once they begin to grow, there's no nutrients for them to uptake from this soil. So we need to add something to them. That's gonna be true of anything you plant in containers. Anytime you plant anything in containers, whether you're just seed starting or whether you're allowing it to grow in the container indefinitely, you're gonna wanna add a water-soluble fertilizer so that your plants have nutrients to uptake from that soil. Thank you so much for hanging out with me in my garden and seed starting these tomatoes and summer squash. May your garden be filled with grace and may you be abundantly blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.